Good morning. Tornichte, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to be back to Dublin, to enjoy wonderful hospitality, but also great cooperation that I established already in 2012 during the chairmanship of the Organization for Security and Cooperation that I work for of Ireland. Those were the times when we were starting to talk about online world and how to tackle issues that are so important for our life, for our well-being, and for the issues that this project is trying to tackle. I'm very honored to have been invited to address you here today on what has become one of the most challenging and difficult tests of our time: how to tackle violent extremism and terrorism without undermining our fundamental freedoms, civil liberties, and how do we do this with the full respect of human rights and democratic values. I'm particularly delighted to be able to talk to such an eclectic mix of academics and experts, and I hope some journalists, who, through your dedicated efforts and research, are making important contributions in moving this discussion forward. And I cannot emphasize enough the role of academia, the role universities should play in trying to discuss and tackle these issues. It is crucial and is becoming more important for all that are engaging in these discussions. We cannot let just international organizations or civil society or industry discussing this without proper research, proper data, and scientific view on the issues that are extremely important nowadays. On early morning in June last year, an 18-year-old Norwegian citizen was arrested at Landvetter airport outside Gothenburg in Sweden. A covert investigation launched a couple of months earlier showed that the young ethnic Norwegian was increasingly being radicalized and that he attempted to go to Syria to join ISIL-Daesh. In the late afternoon on the very same day, police came to the house of well-known Norwegian filmmaker Ulrich Rosen. He was working on a film on extreme Islamism and the recruitment of foreign fighters, to which the 18-year-old contributed. Through surveillance of communications, the police had information that Rosen was in possession of recordings that, in the police's opinion, would be significant evidence in the criminal case against the radicalized 18-year-old. The police searched the filmmaker's house, where his film studio was also located, and seized unpublished material consisting of 6 to 8 hours of recordings he did with the young man. The material was sealed and handed over to district court the next day with the request to maintain the seizure. The filmmaker, of course, protested, claiming it would be in violation of his journalist's right to protection of sources. This real-time scenario, taken from a country with some of the finest democratic tradition, is illustrative of the new threats to freedom of expression posed by terrorism and increased security concerns in Europe. And it's extremely important, and I'm really thankful that you invited me to talk about this angle, that is somehow pushed away, put under the carpet, and everything in the name of security. You will probably hear some views you disagree with, but you also have to bear with my views and the mission I have. And the mission is to promote and protect freedom of speech and freedom of the media. In literally all OSCE states, and there are 57, we start the region from the OSCE, from US, Canada, all the way to Europe, covering all EU member states, the Balkan part of the world that I come from. I'm from Sarajevo, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, all the way to Russia, Central Asia, South Caucasus, and our youngest participating states, Mongolia. So you can only imagine how difficult it is to tackle all these issues that are related to free speech. But of course, at this event, I'm going to focus on the topic of the day. So in literally all the states, I see more or less the same. Journalists and other media actors are forced to hand over their unpublished material and reveal their sources to police in terror probes. Journalists and their sources are increasingly subject to surveillance and other forms of interception of communication. Content is being blocked online, and journalists are attacked, intimidated, imprisoned while reporting on terrorism-related issues. All, again, in the name of security. What is not illustrative with this case from Norway, however, is how the case eventually was decided. And that is also why I wanted to pause for it for a few minutes in my introduction to you here today. In a remarkable ruling on 15th of November last year, the Norwegian Supreme Court overturned the lower court's decision to uphold the seizure. The Supreme Court found anonymity for broad protection against exposure of journalistic sources, even in the context of a government's anti-terror investigation. In contrast to the widespread international tendency to sacrifice freedom of expression in times of crisis, the ruling recognizes the crucial importance of a free press. For this reason, this ruling, this legal decision, was also awarded the 2016 Columbia Global Freedom of Expression Award for the most significant ruling last year. I think the court hit the nail on the head when describing Rolfsen's documentary at the heart of investigative journalism, and pointing out that the project addressed a central and urgent problem in a society about which the general public and authorities have a need for knowledge and insight. Those things should not be hidden from people. The only way this project was made possible was through the trust the filmmaker had with his sources. Effective protection of these sources was accordingly by the judges considered vital to creating the documentary and for the public's right to information. As I stated then, publicly, following the ruling, the decision should serve as an example for how similar issues should be dealt with in other countries. Democracies should lead by example. And this is the issue that I'm raising with participating states that are traditionally safe haven for free speech, for the respect of human rights. If they fail, if we fail, then what do you think is going to happen in other parts of the world? That is why I'm sometimes too critical when it comes to the moves I see from many states that, again, should be leading by example. And I will name several. I'm, however, not too optimistic. Even though in my work I have to be optimistic, in order to protect free speech and freedom of the media, you need to be optimistic. But when it comes to the moves of governments of the OSCE participating states and beyond, I'm not optimistic. All over the region and beyond, I see governments attempting to counter violent extremism and terrorism by adopting measures, initiating programs and initiatives that restrict freedom of expression, privacy, and other human rights. Should we not be willing to give up some of our freedoms in exchange of greater security, is the question I ask from time to time. After the brutal terrorist attacks in Paris last year, when the whole world was left in dismay after the killing of, among other, 8 journalists at Charlie Hebdo, we questioned ourselves. How could this happen? How could a terrorist in such a well-coordinated attack on one of the most obvious terror goals in Europe escape the radar of some of the world's best intelligence services in a world where so many digital clues and traces are left behind? But 10 months later, despite massive security arrangements and expanded surveillance powers in France, terrorists managed to strike again. Some media reports allege that terrorists used encrypted applications to communicate with each other, adding yet another concern to government's ability to access information on terrorist activities. Without doubt, the terrorist attacks in 2015 created a special momentum. a dangerous momentum for European lawmakers and policymakers to rethink the concept of security and surveillance. They ask themselves whether cooperation and sharing of information between police and intelligence services is sufficient. Is enough information being gathered? Are the police powers to search and analyze data great enough? Should there be restraints on the use of encrypted and anonymous communications? These are all the questions that governments are asking themselves, but also civil society, international organizations, all of us engaging in this struggle and fight against the evil. At the very outset, I think we need to reject the idea that security and liberty should exist in some sort of balance with each other, meaning that a gain in one comes at the expense of the other. Security and human rights should not be looked upon as opposite or contradicting values. Governments and societies must recognize that there is no reason or excuse to justify the erosion of or violation of the fundamental human rights which form the bedrock of modern democracies. The challenge of our time is to understand that security is a component of human rights. Without the full enjoyment of human rights, there is no security. This is the idea Benjamin Franklin referred to in his iconic quote, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." In my work, I do fully recognize, first, the reality we live in, and then I fully respect the importance of any government's legitimate right and security efforts in order to make our society safer. And who would challenge that? That is also the role of the government. But then again, not at the expense of respect of human rights. And this is something we should not forget. While the internet had brought unprecedented possibilities for communications, it is indeed also exploited by violent extremists to spread hateful propaganda, as we heard from Toniste, incite acts of terrorism, radicalize and recruit new members, and facilitate communications for organizational and operational purposes. But fighting the use of the internet for terrorist purposes, as well as revealing and prosecuting other serious crimes, require principled thinking and a firm and steady approach. All necessary mechanisms protecting free expression and media freedom must be preserved in order not to obstruct journalists' work. As the OSCE Representative on Freedom of Media, I'm mandated to closely observe laws, policies and other forms of interventions by participating states, which might interfere in the exercise of free expression and free media. These include, of course, media laws and regulations, but it is a brutally honest fact that more and more of my work relates to anti-terrorist legislation and policies. We live in a very dangerous time, and this is something we should also not forget or neglect. It is, in a way, time where things dramatically changed. Europe looks different. Recent terrorist attacks and new lines of conflict in Europe are fundamentally altering and challenging the way we think about our basic human rights, such as freedom of expression and privacy. We see a shrinking place for civil society, journalists, and human rights defenders, and they are increasingly subject to harassment. NGOs are being restricted in their activities, and media freedom is decreasing. And this is all happening as we speak. And this is all happening in many countries of the OSCE that are calling themselves democracies. But as the international official and their representative on freedom of the media, I strongly disagree. It is a sad fact that our very own security has become one of the greatest threats to freedom of speech. At the same time, our societies are marked by an atmosphere with increasing intolerance of dissenting opinion. Taken together, I fear that these factors have created a dangerous cocktail, I would say, of suppression and self-censorship in Europe and beyond. I will mention also several countries that are on my radar when it comes to adoption of the laws that are potentially or directly restricting free speech. Just consider the anti-terror law in Turkey, in effect since 1991. This law is now being used to round on alleged terrorists and others, including members of the media. Only yesterday I had to raise my voice and to use my mandate to talk about the imprisonment of Erol Önderoğlu and two other journalists who were detained and then arrested by the Turkish authorities for spreading terrorist propaganda. Erol Önderoğlu is a friend, and he is a trusted colleague and representative of Reporters Sans Frontières for Turkey. So the last person you would point your finger at, saying that that person is spreading terrorist propaganda. So this is also the way some governments are using their authority in order to stop restrictive, provocative voices that are challenging issues of concern. In Russian Federation, the Duma adopted changes in the Code of Administrative Offenses last year. These changes substantially increase penalties for media found to be producing or publishing materials containing public calls for publicly justifying extremist or terrorist activities, although terrorist and extremist activities are never specifically defined. So it is used to suppress critical voices, not actually to fight extremism and terrorism. In Canada, Bill C-51, intended to fight terrorism, is still under consideration in Parliament. The last draft criminalizes a number of vague offenses, including advocating and promoting terrorism or recklessness in carrying out your activities could lead to terrorist acts being committed. I can think of nothing as confusing as such vaguely worded legislation that has the potential to determine whether anyone who simply disagrees with government policy is found to be criminally liable for someone else's potential behavior. And this is happening all the time. The United Kingdom, as an example on surveillance, where the Investigatory Powers Bill passed the House of Commons earlier this month, despite major human rights concerns expressed both nationally and internationally. Among others, the bill gives powers to issue bulk warrants without the existence of reasonable suspicion before issuing the surveillance measure. This is clearly running counter to principles set out by the European Court of Human Rights. It has flaws in control mechanisms, as recently pointed out by the Parliament's very own Committee on Human Rights, which submitted proposals to improve the bill to further enhance the compatibility of the legal framework with human rights. And journalists, they pay so much attention on how to cover their tracks that they end up in a way feeling like spies instead of journalists because of all these attempts by different governments trying to reveal sources, trying to find out who do they talk to, using surveillance powers and all these other mechanisms in order to find out what certain journalists, filmmakers, or human rights defenders are trying to cover. Because surveillance activities may fundamentally alter the way the state protects the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, any legislation that allows government snooping must be narrowly drawn, proportionate, and include guarantees as a basic precondition for investigative journalism that confidentiality of journalist sources would not be compromised. Accordingly, an effective and thorough judicial review, which is on so many occasions recently neglected. Many governments, including French government, is totally pushing away judicial oversight in order to tackle these issues. And these are dangers of our time. This is something that not too many are talking about because it's uncomfortable. Governments do not like to be criticized. They do not like to hear things similar to what I'm saying. And that is why I think it's extremely important that we keep talking and really pointing finger when we see that our civil liberties and our rights are in danger. It is also of utmost importance to maintain the right to communicate anonymously and via encrypted technologies. As it was highlighted in a report last year from a good friend, a UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, encryption and anonymity provide the privacy and security necessary for the exercise of the right to freedom of expression in the digital age. It may also be essential for exercising other human rights. It is also important to remember that introducing regulation on encryption, among others, allowing to backdoors where governments can slide in, will also make encrypted files vulnerable for terrorists and other criminals. The second main category of threats is online censorship. Policies and practices related to content takedown, blocking, filtering measures online remains an increasing concern, as they frequently are in violation of the state's obligations to guarantee freedom of expression. They are not respecting the principles that apply for restricting free expression. As thoroughly outlined in my office's recently published guidebook that I invite you to find on the web, Media Freedom on the Internet, it was written by a colleague, a legal expert, professor at the Bilgi University in Istanbul, Yaman Akdeniz, where he looked at the issues of transparency, accountability, and the right to reply. In many countries, these decisions are also made by administrative bodies that lack independent judicial oversight. The Polish Parliament adopted a new Counter-Terrorism Act last week, which, among others, gives the Internal Security Agency the mandate to block websites deemed a threat to national security. Again, no judicial oversight. The courts are given 5 days to review the legitimacy of the blocking, but then there is also additional mechanism to stop that. In blocking policies, as well as in other projects and initiatives, it is a major challenge that there are no generally accepted definitions of extremism and terrorism. As pointed out again in the last report of the UN Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, Ben Emerson, there are also conceptual shortcomings when it comes to differences between violent extremism and terrorism. The terms are often used without a clear definition of the boundaries between them. In several countries, we see that failing to clearly define the notion of extremism and similar offenses in anti-extremism laws led to abuses and attempts to curtail legitimate political debate. This may have a chilling effect on journalists working on matters of public interest, and I would say it already has. Only this week, 2 prominent journalists and human rights activists were detained in Turkey, as I told you. And this is just one drop in a sea of problems. There are more than 30 journalists in prison in Turkey on terrorism charges. There were 120 in 2010 when I started my mandate, and they were released in a process of democratization, when we thought there is some sort of hope when it comes to respect of human rights in Turkey. And at the moment, as I said, 30 and increasing almost every day. So how do we deal with this problem that we see in so many countries that are surrounding European Union? Not to mention the countries that are candidate and potential candidate countries to the EU. Also, social media networks are under pressure to censor hate speech online. Less than a month ago, and Toniste mentioned this initiative, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and other tech giants agreed to an EU code of conduct. Among others, they agreed to review valid requests for removal of illegal hate speech in less than 24 hours and to remove or disable access to the content if necessary. Tech companies should have a role in combating violent extremism online, but I think it is problematic that tech companies, as stated in this code, should take the lead in policing controversial speech online based on purely defined codes of conduct and concepts and outside of an accountable democratic framework. In this way, the law runs the risk of being downgraded to a second-class status, to use the words of Access Now, one of the many NGOs protesting to this agreement. The problem I have with this agreement as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media is the fact that the responsibility is shifted from the state to the industry. And this is a problem. And this is a problem also giving this responsibility to the ISPs, intermediaries. They should not do this. Cooperation is great, But as it states now in this code, there are several very problematic clauses that can definitely interfere with free speech, freedom of the media, and respect of human rights. Short-term and long-term. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom of expression should be looked at as a tool and possibility to counter violent extremism and terrorism, and not as a restraint. This is one of the key messages I gave together with other international rapporteurs on freedom of expression in a joint declaration on freedom of expression and countering violent extremism issued on this year's World Press Freedom Day. It is available online. I also brought some copies here with me. We sent it to all governments and all international organizations, hoping that they will read it and remember how important it is to respect our human rights even in difficult times. Freedom of expression plays a critical role in promoting equality and in combating intolerance. Media, the internet, and other digital technologies plays an essential role in keeping society informed and to provide avenues for counter-speech, which I also think is a topic that should be discussed. How to fight problematic speech, how to counter this speech. I would always say with more speech and not with restrictions. In my view, a more interesting and sustainable solution that was made part of the recently launched EU Code of Conduct Agreement is the tech companies' commitment to strengthen their cooperation with civil society organizations that help flag hateful content when it goes online and promote counter-narratives to hate speech. It is positive that intermediaries are being called upon to engage in more proactive and efficient strategy by using their capabilities in communicating against violent extremism. And we see that social media networks are responding by increasingly engaging in outreach activities and partnering with organizations working on countering violent extremist content to empower credible non-governmental voices. As it was pointed out in a study made by the British think tank Demos for Facebook last year, combating extremism with counter-speech is faster, more flexible and responsive, capable of dealing with extremism from anywhere and in any language, and retains the principle of free and open public spaces for debate. Free speech and free media do not come naturally and can never be taken for granted. These values must be constantly justified, reaffirmed, and strengthened, along with other fundamental human rights and freedoms. Free speech, privacy, and other liberties are the most precious values we have in our society. Limiting the space for freedom of expression and civic space advances the goals of those promoting, threatening, and using terrorism and violence. If we start giving up on our fundamental freedoms, we will erode the very substance of democracy and the rule of law. We should be thinking in terms of the new ways to connect and bring closer human rights and security in the 21st century. We must remember that human rights, though they may be temporarily suppressed, will always rebound, and that there is no security without free flow of information. Freedom of expression and free media play important roles in fostering meaningful debate on security issues and can help us to effectively address new challenges. By pitting human rights concerns and security issues against each other, we run the risk that both will be conquered. We may find ourselves with no security and no rights, and this is the last thing we want. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. Who would like to go first? You, sir. And if you could also say what your name is and what organization you come from.
My name is Dunja Mijatović, and I'm not affiliated. I'm a practitioner in the area of conflict resolution. Sure. And I'm just curious about some of the terminology on terrorism and extremism. You pointed out how ill-defined they are. And I've been working on the Arab-Israeli peace process. I'm And I'm just conscious of the role terms like extremism and terrorism play secretly in the background, but incredibly powerfully in shaping people's attitudes and make it very easy to isolate a voice, an opinion that one doesn't like. Your examples from Turkey would be good ones as well of the same thing. So how confident are we in our use of those terms that we're not simply picking up some of the narrative which comes directly from imperialism and our well-trodden path in that area in Europe, and simply applying it to the latest set of enemies, and in that way reinforcing attitudes that are profoundly anti-libertarian and anti-democratic. Thanks.
I completely agree, and I think what you just said, and in a way asked the question, are we confident enough? I think we are too confident in pointing our finger at people and labeling them as terrorists and extremists. And I talk based on the cases, on the real life stories, about people that I just mentioned during my speech, that are now labeled as potential terrorists in Turkey because they simply disagreed with the government's view and they were challenging government policies and criticizing, and they were probably provocative. So it is very easy to use the term of terrorism, particularly, in order to label people without thorough investigation, without really looking, if there is anything there inciting, violence. And what it happens in Turkey is that most of the cases you have journalists labeled as terrorists. So how come you have so many journalists engaging in terrorism? Of course, each and every case needs to be investigated, and each and every case deserves particular attention in order to really see if there is a threat to the state or to the society. But from my position as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, unfortunately, I cannot say that I'm confident that this is really investigated in a right way, not just in Turkey, in many other states. People are simply labeled as terrorists because of different views. And this is something we need to pay enormous attention to. And this is something that can affect political debate in the society and can affect well-being of the society. The moment you label somebody as a terrorist, that person is labeled. And nowadays it seems to me that we are so easily accepting this kind of rhetoric that can be extremely damaging.
Yes, sir. Yep. Put your hand in the air, yeah. White shirt. Sorry.
I just have a question. Some of the comments that the Minister made, and then I'll go to the question. So I have a question. Oh, I want to reflect on what the Minister said, and then I'll have a question for yourself. The Minister said that we in Ireland are taking in, have accepted that we'll take in 4,000 refugees. And, but at present, according to Amnesty International, we've only taken in 4 over the last couple of months. Europe has stated very clearly that it believes in values like democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, liberty. Yet, when it comes to a counter-narrative, which you were speaking of, about promoting these values, we seem to be unable to really emphasize our beliefs, really emphasize our government and our institutions aren't really applying those values and beliefs at a policy level, or at least if they are very slow to react to the real situations that are happening, for instance, in the Mediterranean, or where it comes to online propaganda or the promotion of terrorism. So on a value issue, do we really have the commitment of our values, or do we really believe in our values? Because as the Minister said, you made a value judgment that you're going to take in 4,000 refugees, but you've only taken in 4 as of yet, according to Amnesty International. So how do we adjust those values with actual practical positions that are applied.
Can we get a microphone?
I don't want to take from the topic under discussion, but just to put the facts on the table. We've media present here as well, and for the sake of everybody who's in the room, at the end of September we'll have taken 500 refugees under the resettlement program, which is from the camps in Lebanon. And that's a very important program we've been part of. It's called the resettlement program. The European Union has had particularly difficulties in relation to the relocation problem because of the movement of refugees right through up to Germany and Sweden, and so the hotspots that were being established have been somewhat slow. But that's been resolved now, and we're expecting far more refugees to be arriving right across Europe, because the various issues in relation to the establishment and the identification of refugees are now being dealt with properly. But as I say, I don't want to distract from the core topic, but just to put those facts on the table.
Any questions for the keynote?
Sometimes we see those wonderful words on paper, and then in practice we have a completely different situation, because it's simply not respected. And we have all these wonderful resolutions and conventions and human rights, but then in practice what you see is a completely different story. But I do not think I understood your question correctly. I mean, do we have values? I mean, each and every person probably has values.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jerry. I have a super quick question about our perception in terms of terrorist news agencies. So there are so many terrorist news agencies around the world in different countries targeting different languages. A good example of this would be the IMAC news agency affiliated with ISIS, an official ISIS mouthpiece. Will we be protecting their freedom of speech and their journalists as well if we're moving forwards with giving more freedom of speech to journalism? Will that include journalists of terrorist news agencies as well? Thank you.
Anything that has, but this is again also my view, and it's not something that is written on paper. I see very clear red line when it comes to free speech, and it's probably related to the part of the world that I come from. I already said I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We experienced the use of propaganda, the use of media for injecting hatred, division, killing people, ethnic cleansing. This is not free speech. This is not journalism. This is, I would say, anarchy. This is something that has to be vigorously tackled by the rule of law, and measures need to be taken in order to stop anything that is inciting violence or calling for acts of killing people. So that would be my answer to this. But if people are provocative, if people are, criticizing, if people are, even saying things, we do not like or we completely disagree, those voices should be heard and they should not be suppressed. But that has nothing to do with fighting violence, hatred, and calling for killing of different races or people of different opinions, or anything that is related to killing of individuals, which unfortunately we see on so many occasions. So the clear answer is that's not free speech that I would protect, and that is not my role.
Anybody else? Amy McKee. Take your mic, Amy.
Sorry. Amy, I'm a psychologist for the UK Counter-Terrorism Policing. This is more just wondering about your thoughts on it, really. The recent case in America where Apple refused to help us unlock the iPhones of the shooters. I wondered what your thoughts were around the checks and balances around that kind of process and the legal arguments that went on around that. Thank you.
That particular case was well covered by a colleague of mine that I already mentioned, David Kay, who is the UN rapporteur, and he wrote a very good article on it. He was not for the use of particular key in order to open or to give the possibility for opening, because he thought, like many other who were engaged in this debate, that FBI already has possibilities to do this without the engagement of tech firms, and at the end we learned that it was done by a hacker, if that was the whole truth about the case. But what stayed at the end is that definitely industry, intermediaries, search engines and these giants should not be used in order to provide this kind of opening. Many had completely different views on this. But I think that the civil society had a long-term view and also concerns that this will open Pandora's box. And this was the main problem. So it was not just this one particular case, it was actually what would be created with this example if it was used, if Apple agreed to it in the future, with China, with Russia, and with many other countries that were just waiting for this kind of opportunity as an open door for this. So as a free speech advocate, I would stand on that side. But at the same time, I also think we need to recognize the real threats and what needs to be done sometimes. At the end, this case was somehow solved, but I'm sure we will have more cases similar and even more complicated in the future that we will have to deal with. And that is why I think a cooperation and coordination of agencies working on these things with civil society, with industry is crucial, but not by ordering certain companies to do the work of the police or investigation, or not to mention judiciary.
Any other questions? Down the back.
Hi, I appreciated the point made earlier that the terminology we use comes mostly from the security field. I would be interested in exploring new sources of that terminology. Do you have other suggestions?
Suggestions for terminology.
As opposed to terrorism, violent extremism, radicalization?
No, I don't have a suggestion. It's not my role to have suggestion for something. The problem is that they are so vaguely defined in certain documents and legislations, and that is why they are affecting free speech and free media in the long term. When it comes to labeling people as terrorists, then not terrorists, then I have a problem. So there are other terms that are already existing. You can say that the person is provoking certain arguments or is provoking certain disagreements in society, but you cannot just simply label a person as a terrorist because this is something that gentleman just before was stating, that we are in a way too confident in using these terms without real discussion and without really going into the topic and really trying to see if this is terrorism or is just some kind of extreme views that are challenging society. We should not shy away, or we should not try to avoid controversial, provocative discussions. Somehow we are becoming more vulnerable to certain when it comes to offending people, again, we keep forgetting there is no human right not to be offended. Of course, there is no duty to offend people, but at the same time, we need to accept speech that is controversial. And by labeling it terrorists in certain cases or extremists, it can create huge problems. And it's already created, but I don't have a suggestion for a different terminology.
David, go ahead.
Hi, David Shanzer from Duke University. Just kind of following up on that question, especially with our lone actor terrorism. So law enforcement authorities face a pretty big challenge in trying to prevent these. And sometimes the earliest clues might be things that people are saying on social media and so on. I think in the United States, our FBI, they try very hard, I think, to make a distinction between pure First Amendment activities and conduct in terms of when an investigation can even be opened. I'm not talking about somebody being arrested or publicly labeled a terrorist, but I'm saying when you start an investigation. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on when it's okay in a democracy for a law enforcement entity to look at First Amendment kind of activities or speech as, not something that you can be arrested for, but something you can be can open an investigation based on what you say rather than what you do.
If we know the answer to this, probably we will not be here discussing this. But when it comes to First Amendment and the way it is handled in the U.S., it is quite different than here in Europe for obvious reason, because of different laws and protection that free speech has in U.S. When it's a time for the law enforcement agencies and judiciary to look at, it is again when it is crossing this red line, which is very difficult to define, and that is, again, calling for incitement, calling for killing people, and definitely not in the area of protection of human rights, including free speech and freedom of the media. So what is also problematic, I do not think that the law enforcement agencies are trained or equipped enough in order to be able to tackle these issues properly. There is a need for them, and this is something that we are trying to do in our work, to tell them that they need to engage with the civil society, not to mention academia and all others dealing with this issue. We have a huge problem with countering abuse of female journalists online, female journalists and bloggers. This is completely another area of the one we are discussing here. But the main problem we see is that the law enforcement agencies, they do not know how to address these issues and when to act and when to take these cases to judiciary. There are many journalists and bloggers, female journalists and bloggers, closing their accounts, switching their Twitter or Facebook accounts because of online abuse, rape threats, and death threats. That's not part of free speech debate. That is crime, and that should be tackled. But I agree with you that there is a huge gap there, and that law enforcement in many countries are not really, again, equipped enough or educated enough in order to know when to use certain communication in order to tackle it. And the same goes for online extremism and terrorism. In so many cases, you see when the case is revealed, and then you read it, and then you realize there is nothing there, but just an attempt to have some discussion. And fear is in a way driving, all of us discussing this issue, because we still do not know how to tackle the problems that we are facing in our societies. We are still tapping in the dark, and that is why I think it's extremely important to have coordination, but I would also say more transparency in all the attempts.
Okay, we've got time for one last question. Daniela.
My name is Daniela Pizarro from University of Hamburg and VOX-Pol. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the issue of media responsibility when reporting on terrorism? Because as we all know, of course, terrorists do want a lot of exposure, and media just gives it to them every time. So do you have these kind of discussions as well in your work? Thanks.
Of course, I mean, this is not just when it comes to this subject, when it comes to any sensitive issue, there is a need for a really high level of responsibility. In addition to this, what is needed is media pluralism that many countries enjoy, like this country here, but in so many parts of the OSCE region and beyond, you only have state broadcasters. So they are reporting only what the government is telling them to report. And that is a huge problem. So when it comes to responsibility, sometimes you need to protect the voices that are challenging the views of the governments, that is telling society that everything is fine and nothing is bad. So how to bring these two together and how to talk about the responsibility at the same time, it's difficult. It's not something, it can be like a general view about the whole region. We work with media outlets, with media companies on building code of conduct. The latest we did is how to report on refugee issues. My office is not School of Journalism. I'm not telling journalists how to do their job, but I do work with Deutsche Welle, with BBC School of Journalism, many wonderful NGOs around the world, training and really trying to help in this process. But then, you sometimes come to the wall and you see the situation in certain country. I don't have to name it. I mean, you would probably come up with many examples where there is no possibility for society to really learn what is happening because there is no independent media, there are no any differing voices, and there is just only one view that is very careful and very neutral, telling people what is going on. And that is also wrong. So when it comes to responsibility, there are always question marks, and I have to look at, as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, on case-by-case basis. Because sometimes government, they talk about responsibilities, and responsibility for them means not to criticize, not to provoke, not to open subjects that are sensitive. And then we come to the situation where there is complete dark, and what is left is online media and independent NGOs and reporters trying to report about the issues of the society. But that, again, those are extreme cases. This is something that is not happening in this part of the world, and I would say in Europe. But in places that I work, it's definitely the case. Responsibility is a very dangerous term that I try not to use. I call it rather professionalism, because responsibility in many states means just be quiet and do not criticize the president, otherwise you will end up in prison.
Okay, thanks very much. No more time, no more questions, John, I'm afraid.